Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to Protecting Our Planet Through Maths. As you might have guessed from my background image here, I do maths in some slightly unusual places, which may have been places you might have learned about this morning if you're around for the session around ice. So there's going to be a little bit more of that and some slightly other different things. I've got three guests with me here today who use maths in their day jobs in ways that they use maths to protect the planet. But before I introduce them, I'll just tell you a little bit about what I do and why, as a mathematician, I'm sitting here with a big chunk of ice behind me. So I would just go ahead and very quickly show you some pictures because things are better with images. So I use maths in my job to predict the future, but I use maths like this. So how on earth does a mathematician end up in the Arctic, this is the Arctic here, holding a rifle? Well, what my job is to use maths to work out how heat gets through glaciers in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And to do that, I use this equation, which to some of you probably looks, actually most of you today looks quite scary. Maybe your teachers might recognize it. But I'm going to tell you it's not actually that scary. If you're doing A-level maths, you might have seen an equation like this. It's just a slightly fancier version of that. So I really solve in my day-to-day job the kind of things that people do during their A-level. And I solve this equation over and over again to work out how much our polar regions are heating up. The reason that I do that was really motivated by me seeing this satellite image when I was at school. So this was the Larsen B ice shelf in Antarctica. It's a satellite image, so we're looking down from space. Everything that's white there you can see is ice, everything that's dark is ocean. And to give you an idea of scale, those kind of ridgy features over towards what should be the left-hand side of your screen, they're mountain ranges. So this was a huge area of ice. And I say was because just after this image was taken, we had this situation. Sudden and dramatic collapse right across the ice shelf. The area of ice that was lost was about twice the size of Greater London. So that's a huge amount of ice that was lost very, very quickly. And we think that the reason that this was happening is because the ice shelf was heating up on the surface. And of course, when ice heats up, as we all know, it forms water, it melts. And the Larsen B ice shelf was absolutely covered in lakes before it melted. And what we noticed just before the ice shelf collapsed is that these lakes started to drain. So first one would drain, then those around it, and those around that, and a chain reaction that we think was key in this sudden collapse of the ice shelf. So I use maths to try and work out where this might be happening in other places in Antarctica. And the reason that we're doing this is ultimately because of sea level rise, and that's something that's going to affect all of us. So we know that obviously collapsing ice shelves in Antarctica is bad news for the penguins and for the environment there. But what happens in our polar regions definitely doesn't stay in our polar regions. You can see in this graph here that I've just put up that both Antarctica and Greenland are contributing to sea level rise, and the amount they're contributing is increasing decade by decade by about 13 millimeters every decade. That amount is increasing. And even though those numbers sound very small, that's an extra 13 millimeters over the whole planet, which is a huge, huge amount of extra water to be sloshing around in the ocean. And that's very bad news, especially when we get things like big storms or when we're living in cities that are right by the coast. So understanding what is happening to our polar regions really does matter for the whole planet. And I'm trying to work out exactly how much water we're going to get out of Antarctica ultimately, and is going to end up in our oceans. And that's taken me to a lot of exciting places. So I currently work at Cardiff University, but I've also had the opportunity to work at a few different universities around the UK and also in America at Georgia Tech. And it's taken me up to the Arctic as well. And that is how I ended up as a mathematician being in the Arctic. You can see I've labeled it here. One of those things is me, one of those is the Arctic. But the reason that I had to learn to shoot a rifle, you may still be thinking, well, what do you do there? Like, do you go and shoot at the glaciers? No, the reason we go to the Arctic is to take measurements to back up the calculations that we're doing with maths. So here in Cardiff, I'll sit here on my laptop and I'll do lots of calculations, but we have to take measurements to check that we are getting the right answers with the maths. But the reason we have the rifle, and this is something I really never expected to be doing as a mathematician, is we have to learn to protect ourselves from these guys, polar bears. So I should say, when we go to the Arctic, it is, of course, the polar bear's natural habitat. The last thing we ever want to do is hurt them, because for me personally, I'm going there because we want to look after their environment. But polar bears have been known to actively hunt humans, because as our climate is changing, they're getting a lot hungrier. The ice that they used to hunt is melting. So when they see a lot of scientists out on the glacier, especially in these fancy bright orange jackets, they're probably going to be thinking lunch. Now, I'm lucky that the closest I've been to a polar bear is this guy in the picture here. And he actually guards the baggage carousel up in the Arctic for when we go up there to do our field work. But we did find one day, when we've been out and taking our measurements on the glacier, these. So hopefully you can make out these footprints. These are, of course, polar bear footprints. And to give you an idea of the size, these were my colleague's footprints. I think he has kind of like really big feet, like size 11 or something, maybe even bigger than that. So this was a really very big bear. And just next to that, I also found a separate set of footprints. And you can see, hopefully from the size of my finger, these were much smaller. So identical, but much smaller, which you may be able to guess, of course, would have been from a baby polar bear. Really cute, right? Absolutely not. That's the last thing you want to see when you're in the Arctic, because if a baby polar bear is there, then mummy polar bear is probably just around the corner, and they're going to be the most aggressive kind of polar bears, because not only are they really hungry, they're going to be wanting to protect their baby from these crazy scientists who are out and nearby. So that's how I ended up doing a very unexpected thing as a mathematician in the Arctic. But I have 3 other guests with me here today who also use maths in their jobs and do some really different things with maths. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves now. So first of all, Paddy, can you tell me what you do in your day job that uses maths?
Yeah, thanks, Sammie. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that. So yeah, great. So similarly to Sammie, I actually work in Arctic environments as well. And during my day job, I'm based at the Natural History Museum, which hopefully some of you have visited in London. And I'm there as a PhD researcher in polar microbiology. So I'm interested in how microbes are being affected by climate change and what that means for changes in these systems. So I'm kind of going to briefly discuss how me as a kid, a pretty cool looking kid, if I may say so myself, on the left here, who had absolutely no interest in maths or really understanding how to do it, kind of just getting by, ended up being a researcher in the Arctic environments who now uses maths every day in my day job. So when I was at school, I was kind of, my main interests were really biology and geography. I think I kind of always related to the idea that you can see it around you. And I got that kind of buzz from understanding things a bit more as they're going on in the world around us. And I kind of always just used maths alongside that because I knew it was a good thing to learn, but I couldn't really see how it was going to be useful in my job. But they told me I needed to do it for university. So I did it at A-levels, and then I got into university and I started doing a bit more about statistics. And I suddenly kind of realized that actually this statistics is a really handy tool to do what I want to understand. So really what I do now is kind of use statistics every day to try and understand these environments a little bit better. So I didn't go to the Arctic with a rifle. Thankfully, someone else did that for me, but I actually went with a spatula, which is an equally as useful tool for doing work in the Arctic. And the reason for that is that I look at these things, which are called microbial mats. And as you can see, a bit like lasagna, spatula is actually a really well-designed tool for picking up things from tricky containers. So I pick up these mat systems, which are these groups of microbes that form in the Arctic environment and actually hold most of the diversity we see. So thankfully, polar bears are, as Sammie says, pretty hard to spot most of the time, and we thankfully didn't come across any either. But what we do get everywhere are microbes, and this is the same for all environments around the world. So when I was at uni, this is kind of what I really got interested in, was actually this huge diversity of life that exists everywhere, and as we've learned over the last few years, can really affect all of us. So my particular interest is in what we call eukaryotic microbes. So these are microorganisms that have cells like us as animal cells, as you might have heard of them. And the idea is that this diversity is really unknown in these environments and really undercharacterized. But as we know, these climates are changing really rapidly, and that means the Arctic's really vulnerable to change. So what I do in my research is I actually look at these microbes in these environments. So when we take these samples, like I did this year in the field, and we put them under a microscope, what we actually see is loads of strange organisms doing weird things. I'm not quite sure what that one in the top right is doing, that's spinning around, but apparently it's all very important. So these things have roles in producing energy from photosynthesis. And actually these mats are made up of cyanobacteria, which is one of the oldest and the first, we believe, photosynthesizing organism in the world. So they contribute as much as plants and rainforests do to global energy production. But then they're sort of moderated, we think, by these protists that I look at. So these other organisms, these animal cell organisms that float around, eat stuff, do things in these mats and have these amazing roles we just don't really understand yet. So I use maths every day now, which is something I never thought I would say. And in doing that, I take samples from the environment using my spatula. I extract DNA, and I do something called environmental DNA sequencing, which is where I just take the mat sample, extract all the DNA I can out of it, and that leaves me with is a lot of A, T, Cs, and Gs, so nucleotide sequences, which have no really association with the environment. And sadly, if I had all the time in the world, I could go and sample everything in the Arctic, but that's just not feasible, and it's also impossible. So what I use is statistics to actually take some samples of these environments and then make predictions about how these microorganisms associate with each other in these environments, and also what they might be doing there. So I went from somebody that really didn't know much about maths, wasn't that sure about it, and now actually it's something that I can apply to my job every day, because it allows me to find these trends and kind of do detective work in these maths and start to understand how they're doing it, even though I can't even see what I'm working on most of the time. So I'm hoping that the others might have a bit more good maths knowledge, but my kind of contribution to this session is just to kind of say is that you don't always have to be amazing at maths to end up having a really important use for maths in your life, and especially in your careers. And for me, maths is something that really helped me do what I want to do, which is study these cool microbes and get to see these amazing environments, such as this ice shelf in Wardhunt in Canada, and also get to work with people from around the world, such as James in the middle here, who was a member of the local Inuit community, and somebody I would never think I'd meet in my life, because we live about 4,000 miles away from each other. So yeah, hopefully, thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen.
That's amazing. Thanks, Paddy. I can't believe we have two people in the same Zoom room who ended up in the Arctic through doing maths. This is very strange. Annie, do you want to share how you use maths in your day job? Please don't tell me you're also running away from polar bears.
No, I'm not running away from polar bears. I am instead, hopefully you can see that screen, can you? If we share that now. So no, I'm not running away from polar bears. However, I'm going to start with a caveat on here. I hated maths at school, absolutely hated it. And I would do anything I could to avoid doing maths because I was scared of it. But that said, I had a love of kind of the natural planet and how the planet works. So like Paddy, I wanted to understand how stuff happened. So I went and did my degree, my undergraduate degree in geography, and I got really into physical geography, so kind of understanding how rivers change our environment. And a big part of that was understanding how flooding works. So what you've got on the screen at the moment is a flood model. So I use maths in my everyday job now, trying to understand how floods happen and how we can use maths to build these models so I can predict where floods are going to happen, how big they're going to be, and what we can do to protect ourselves, our planet, our livelihoods from these big flood events. So if I let this video play, what you can see is that in the middle of the screen, we've got the big blue channel, which is our river. And surrounding that, we can see that we've got our map. So that's in kind of the gubbins, or the kind of behind the scenes of the model. That's an elevation model. So we kind of look at how different elevations change across the landscape. And you can see the colours that are coming on the screen are the outputs of the model. So essentially, like Sammie, we run, so behind every cell of this model, so about every 30 centimetres across this area, which is about 1 kilometre squared, we have a cell, and in each of those individual cells, we solve mathematical equations. So like Sammie's equation solving, we just do it here for flooding. And you can see here that the actual flood that happened is kind of behind the model itself. So you can kind of see these areas of flood waters. And what we're doing here is just checking that our model is working. And you can begin to see it's actually inundating or making those areas flood. So we're actually fairly confident that this model's pretty good at predicting what's going to happen in this area. So the way I use maths in my daily job is to actually understand the processes needed that we kind of that feed into these models. So flood risk is due to increase and double by 2050. So the number of people, the businesses that are exposed to it, your houses that are exposed to it, are going to significantly increase. And our climate models, so another way of using maths in kind of thinking about flooding, are predicting that we're going to have increased in the size of floods. So floods are going to get bigger, but they're also going to happen much, much more frequently. And we don't really know how our environment's going to respond to that. So by using these flood models, we can begin to change them, put bigger floods through them. We can change kind of the input parameters. So we can kind of forward look and guess what's going to happen in the future to see where we might be able to better protect the environment. But what's behind this is simple maths. So we need to try and link the maths behind it, which is just an equation, with actually what's physically happening in the environment. And understanding where maths falls over, so where it's not very good at predicting kind of what's happening, is again part of my day job. So like Sammie and Paddy, I've been out across the world and done field work across kind of Chile, North America, done bits and pieces in Australia. So again, my maths has taken me across the world to try and understand how we can help people alleviate the effects of flooding. And this is coming from somebody who was scared of maths at school and could never have imagined using maths every day as I do now. So yeah, that's my background and how I use maths.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Annie. And before I hand over to our final guest, just a reminder, we have a chance to ask questions today. So do pop your questions into the Q&A and I'll come to those as soon as we've heard from our last speaker. Or if you're in a class, get your teacher to put the question in for you. But I will now hand over to Alex. So Alex, everyone here seems to be out in the cold or in flooded environments. Do you have to be outside to be a mathematician?
No, I'm mostly in the office, but I think the slide I'm about to share probably has a photo of me outdoors on it. So, but that's not very representative of my day to day. So yeah, I'm a PhD student at Imperial College London, and I work on CCS. So basically, I do a lot of coding at the moment. So I'm mostly indoors. But yeah, I'm just going to give you a quick intro to what CCS is, and then explain a bit about the maths I use to sort of get where I am now, I guess. So CCS stands for carbon capture and storage, and it's a technology that involves capturing CO2 either from industrial plants or sort of directly from the atmosphere, and then transporting that CO2 through pipelines and then storing it underground in rocks. And the main reason we do this is that we want to remove the greenhouse gas CO2 from the atmosphere, because once we've stored it underground, it no longer contributes to global warming. So it's a sort of very good mitigation technology that can help. It will have a role basically in meeting net zero. So yeah, and when you store CO2, it's stored in rocks generally called deep saline aquifers. And these formations are full of this salty brine water. And as you inject the CO2, it can sort of push into the pore space and move that brine out of the way. And over time, the CO2 goes through lots of sort of chemical reactions, and it can dissolve into the brine and eventually react with the rock and form minerals. And once those minerals are formed, they're really stable. So they can stay put in the rock for thousands of years. So that's a really safe long-term way of storage that would prevent CO2 leaking back to the atmosphere and contributing to climate change again. And this sounds like quite a new or unusual technology, I guess, but there's actually quite a lot of projects. So the Sleipner project in Norway started in 1996, and since that time it's injected 16 million tons of CO2, and that's not the only one. So there's a lot more than these three, but the biggest project at the moment is the Gorgon project in Australia. And that's expected to store between 3 and 4 million tons of CO2 each year. And the UK is also planning their own CCS project. So that's on the bottom right there. That's the Endurance project, sort of in the North Sea, kind of near Middlesbrough. But yeah, one of the sort of key concerns with CCS is you can kind of imagine if you're injecting lots of stuff into rocks, there's a lot more stuff down there, the pressure is going to increase. And if you increase the pressure, you might get things like earthquakes or cracks forming. And that's obviously not good, because that could cause damage and deformation. But also from a climate change point of view, if you've got cracks forming, the CO2 might be able to seep back up, which we really don't want. So yeah, my sort of what I do is looking at how we make sure that doesn't happen. So I use coding to basically estimate how much CO2 we can inject underground without those pressures getting high. And that tells you like the limits of what you can store, basically. The coding I use isn't really too complicated. It's kind of based on a few well-known equations, but they weren't too difficult to code. And then in my day-to-day, I use kind of a lot of simple statistical maths, sort of if I'm trying to work out the like averages for the rocks we're trying to store it in. So like the average depth of a storage unit, but not generally complicated maths. And kind of like some of the others, I did maths A level, but only really because it went quite nicely with physics, and I was much more interested in sort of physics and chemistry related science. But I was lucky that I did maths A level in the end, because for me to get accepted onto the course I wanted to do at uni, it was a requirement. So then I studied geology at university, and I really did enjoy that. I really liked all the like volcanology and climate modules and fossils, but it did involve some vector calculus modules that were really, really difficult, and they were much more difficult than any of the maths I do now. So kind of like the takeaway point, I guess, is that I used a lot of maths at university and sort of a lot of maths on my way to getting my PhD, but actually the maths I use day to day now is nowhere near as difficult. So yeah.
Wow, thanks, Alex. That sounds like really important work. It's going to be really important for helping us to achieve net zero. But that's really interesting. The kind of thing, the last thing you were talking about, that we seem to have a lot of accidental mathematicians here. So Annie and Paddy, I can't remember if you said, did you two do A-level maths?
No, I started it and decided I actually really didn't like it. So I ended up doing biology, chemistry, geography at A level, and then picked the maths back up when I was at university in kind of compulsory modules that were related to statistics. So yeah, no A level maths for me.
Yeah, I did do maths A level, and very vividly remember first day filling out my depth, because I think the first session was on surds and everyone was getting on with it, and I had to ask what a surd even was because I'd never even heard of them. So yeah, got through it, but it wasn't my strong point.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I have always felt like a bit of a fraud as a mathematician, because I found maths hard at school. I think a lot of people assume, oh, you do maths to your career, you must have been best in your class. But my best friend was absolutely the one who was best in my class. And I was always just trying to work out how she got it so quickly. And it took me a really long time and pages of scribbling to work out the same thing she could just see instantly. So yeah, a few of you have mentioned that you found maths difficult at school or didn't enjoy it. Do you want to expand on that a bit more for anyone we might have listening today who's thinking, oh, I don't like maths, but maybe I like the sound of these jobs that use maths?
Paddy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. I was going to say it's that's exactly how I felt about it. I think you sometimes at school see people that seem to just get it straight away, whereas for me it was quite something I had to work at. But what really changed with me with maths was really learning more about statistics at A level, and then at university was suddenly like, I get this, it has a function for me. And I think that's the thing to take away, is that it's just an amazing thing to at least have an understanding of, because it just opens so many doors that you don't think are going to come up. And so it's also important to note that even today, I'm still looking up my maths A-level textbook most days if I do want to do any kind of basic statistics. And it's not like I understand most of what I'm doing, but it's having that, it just opens so many doors. And it's really, I think if it's something you're not finding naturally easy to get to, it's about finding that application that can really make it accessible and see results with it.
Yeah, I think just picking up on that, Paddy, it's the same for me. So I really enjoy, or why I started to think, okay, maths is actually quite important, was actually when I could see an applied side to it. Definitely. So my day job now, I work for the Environment Agency, and I work in a team which kind of improves how we do flood modelling. So actually being able to kind of see the applied use of that and see the people we're helping, or we're seeing businesses change how they do stuff, or they kind of future-proof their businesses or their homes, and we kind of reduce flooding impacts for people, for me, that's really important. So being able to kind of see the applied use rather than just kind of staring at an equation on a page, but being able to translate that equation on a page into kind of actual real life outputs, for me, has changed kind of how I think about maths, I think. But I'm still scared of it. It's still, every time I do it, I'm like, oh, can I do that? So yeah, there's still that kind of legacy being scared of it. But I think if you can find that hook that you're interested in, like Paddy said, it's a really cool thing to be able to do.
Yeah, that's really key, isn't it? We've actually got a question on from a related kind of aspect from Farlingay High School. They want to know, what aspect of maths did you enjoy most at school? So we've talked about it being scary, but were there some things even when you were at school you thought that were quite fun?
Alex, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. I quite liked anything once I understood it, I think. So like once I could do, like once I learned how to differentiate and then could just differentiate anything, like it was fairly logical steps, the same thing every time, then I started to enjoy it. But I think that's why it sort of is easier after school, because you're generally using the same math, so like it's less scary because you understand the little bit of maths that you're doing. But yeah, I think anything that I did a lot, and once I understood it, that was the part I enjoyed. Differentiation, integration, I liked. Anything that was sort of proving trigonometry, that was less for me.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think those formulas and algebra that you solve it and then you can work it backwards and you know it's right, it's a really satisfying feeling. I actually remember weirdly during A-levels, it was somehow my favourite to revise maths because of that, because actually the revision is just getting these techniques down and learning these things, whereas biology and geography, which I was also doing, it's a lot more lists and names and a lot of reading, whereas there's actually something, it was the satisfaction, I think. So I think I agree, sort of algebra and equations, and then also in my work, as I was saying, the statistics, because for me, it seems like the prediction side of it is really interesting. So this idea that I can find these patterns in the data that I can't see with my own eyes is kind of what really hooked me on it, is that actually it allows me to see things that I can see myself, especially when nowadays looking at sequences where it's just a big list of letters, like to be able to, it kind of feels like maths is a way of solving problems.
Absolutely. So a lot of us have kind of said today we weren't sure that we were going to do maths in our career, didn't like it to start with, but we've all kind of gone down sciencey routes, even if we weren't planning to be mathematicians. And we have a question in, do you always want to be a scientist? So did you know even when you were unsure about maths that you wanted to be a scientist?
For me, absolutely, yeah. I got hooked on rivers. That was my interest and my passion, and I really, really loved it. And I really wanted to go and do kind of and study them and do the science kind of and understand them. So again, like Paddy was saying, kind of that understanding how stuff works for me was really important. So yeah, I absolutely knew I wanted to be a scientist kind of right from when I was quite little, I think. So before, probably during GCSEs and A-levels, I thought, right, okay, I'd like to go on to university, do a PhD, and that's where I'd kind of like science to take me, so I can go and investigate and do these cool things. And I think particularly geography lends itself to doing these cool things in awesome places. So I think that was a real driver for me as well, was kind of being able to travel with it as well. So yeah, absolutely wanted to be a scientist from kind of day one.
I think similar for me. Like if I think back about my interests when I was a kid, it was like fossil hunting when I was 2, and like space and volcanoes and that kind of stuff, I think was all kind of pointing me towards a geology, geoscience career. But yeah.
I think maybe I'm the opposite. I'm probably right on the other end of the scale. I kind of never thought I was going to be a scientist. I think when I was a teenager, it was every aspiration was to be a man and be a musician and never have to do any more education. But sometimes these things don't take off. But yeah, for me, I think, and actually this is something that I touched on, like I was always interested in biology and geography, because I think I was saying, it was that kind of more of just that real world application, which was always in the back of my mind. But I remember going to university with a lot of people that had always wanted to be scientists, and especially now in a PhD world, it can often feel like there's lots of people that have always wanted to be there, which for them is amazing because they've got to do what they want to do. But I wasn't always 100% this was what I was going to do, but I just fell into it because I just was lucky enough to be able to find something I was interested in. So yeah, these paths can go a lot of different ways. I'm not a musician now, but I'm still enjoying what I'm doing.
think finding what you're interested in is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
We had a question in for Alex specifically asking how long you've been a scientist, but I wonder, because you mentioned you're doing a PhD, Alex, could you explain a little bit about what that involves for people that might not know?
Yeah, so I've just started my second year of my PhD. So everything I spoke about is stuff that I've done in the last year. So I went straight from secondary school to university, did 4 years. So an integrated master's. I did like my undergrad and then a year at the same university, kind of with my undergrad, looking at volcanoes. Then got really interested in the energy industry. And just kind of I researched who at Imperial was researching the stuff I was interested in, emailed, and then that professor sort of helped me, showed me what PhDs were available that year, and then I just started. But I've really not been a scientist for very long.
Well, that's great to see how much you can achieve so quickly as well, because I guess you're not that far ahead in your career really compared to a lot of people that logged on today. So that's great to see what you're doing already. So just to wrap up, I think, Alex, you kind of covered it there, but Paddy and Anne, if you want to come on with any last points, we got asked kind of what inspires us. So you've touched on this a little bit, but any last points you want to add before we have to wrap up today?
I think it's just being able to help solve kind of our future problems. So climate change is it's in the news daily, and I think being able to be a scientist and help us find very, very tiny steps and solutions to kind of mitigating that, I think, is what drives me and inspires me as a scientist.
Yeah, definitely. And exactly the same for me. And just also to add on something I touched on in my talk, but just that opportunity for collaboration is something that really keeps me going. It's amazing that you can just work with people from around the world and go see these things that really, and sort of actually see these things that you hear about in the news, like the Arctic and how it's changing, and to see those things in real life is amazing, and it really puts into perspective what you want to do and make a difference.
That's great. Well, thank you so much to all three of you for coming along today and sharing your stories. Hopefully that's provided some inspiration for everyone watching and showing that even if you don't know if you're going to use maths, it is useful to stick with it, because you never know when it might turn up in your jobs, and there's so many exciting things we can do with maths. But with that, I thank you all for coming along today and listening as well. And for attending Protecting Our Planet Day. There is a STEM Club session on at 3:30, so do stick around for that one if you're able to. But otherwise, say goodbye from us, and thank you again to our speakers.
Thanks, gang. That was great. We're back in the studio, and you can see in front of us we've got lots of exciting things, which we shall come to in a minute. And we've also joined by Professor Ange again, who's been our wonderful host today. Thank you very much for having us.
I have a question for you, actually. Yep. Just before we wrap up, which is, we were talking just there about amazing places you can go as a scientist, and I know you've travelled all over the world, and I just thought you could maybe share with us some of the exciting adventures that you've had really quickly.
Absolutely. I've got to travel pretty much to all the parts of the world. I've flown a plane over the Antarctic as part of a co-pilot while working with bass. I swam with sharks in the Galapagos Islands. I husky sledged in the Arctic, and I worked in the Arabian Sea for a while, where one of my favourite things was trying to throw flying fish back off the deck when they were so windy they all got blown on board.
So this is what happens when you're a scientist. You get to do cool stuff.
Yes.
I think people think, oh, scientists, you're going to be stuck in a lab all day wearing white coats.
Not if you do environmental science, which is both important and exciting.
Do environmental science. Or physics, I should say.
Yeah, or physics, yeah.
It's important in the environment too.
Well, we're going to do a little bit of environmental science plus physics in our first experiment. We're going to do STEM Club at 3:30. But just before we do that, we're going to show some of the videos that we've been playing today, just because they were so good, and you probably missed some of them, so we're going to show a few of those. So
that will start at 3:30. In
Yes.
the meantime, we need to say goodbye to all of you who have been joining us at the schools.
I don't want them to say goodbye, because we've got some fun stuff coming up.
It doesn't start till 3:30 though, so we need to give them half an hour's break to get home from school.
They don't need a break. Okay, you can have a break.
In the meantime, we just have Angie along to say thank you so much for inviting us here to run this amazing event. We're so grateful.
You're very welcome, and it's been a fantastic day. It's been so exciting for us as well, and hopefully for everybody else.
Great.
Basically, we're not leaving. We're just going to move in here.
We're going to keep going. Hopefully, we'll see all of you at STEM Club 3:30. If you need more resources, you can find them on the protectourplanet.org.uk website. Hopefully, we'll see you at 3:30. And thank you again to our wonderful hosts.